November 19th, 1936. Bethlehem Steel Shipyard, Quincy, Massachusetts. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood on the observation deck, overlooking the construction bay, watching American workers assemble the hull of the heavy cruiser Quincy. His naval attaché uniform felt suddenly constricting as he calculated what he was witnessing. The American shipyard was completing major warship construction in 14 months, a timeline Japanese yards required 30 months to match. Around him, 3 other construction bays hummed with similar activity. Yamamoto's hand trembled slightly as he made notes in his leather journal. This single facility could outproduce every Japanese naval yard combined. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What disturbed Yamamoto most profoundly wasn't the speed of construction, but the casual efficiency. American workers operated massive cranes with one hand while eating sandwiches with the other. Welders completed seams in minutes that Japanese craftsmen labored over for hours. The shipyard foreman, a man named O'Brien, who had never attended university, directed operations with a clipboard and a whistle, coordinating 3,000 workers without apparent strain. Yamamoto had commanded fleets with less organizational complexity. The admiral turned to his companion, Captain Kanji Ogawa, naval attaché to the Japanese embassy in Washington. "How many yards like this do they have?" Yamamoto asked in Japanese, knowing no American workers were close enough to overhear. Ogawa consulted his briefing papers. "Bethlehem operates 6 major facilities. Newport News Shipbuilding has 4, New York Shipbuilding 2, Philadelphia Navy Yard, Brooklyn Navy Yard, Mare Island, Puget Sound." He paused, calculating mentally. 17 major naval construction facilities, not counting smaller yards or conversion capacity. Yamamoto absorbed this information in silence. Japan possessed 4 major naval yards. The mathematics was devastating. The tour guide, a cheerful Bethlehem Steel executive named Harrison, approached with barely contained enthusiasm. "Gentlemen, if you'll follow me, I'll show you our new automated welding system. Increases productivity by 40%. As they walked through the facility, Yamamoto noticed details that would appear in his reports to the Imperial Navy Ministry with increasing alarm. The electric power substation, serving this single shipyard, generated more electricity than the entire city of Hiroshima. The steel storage yard contained enough raw material to build 8 destroyers. The worker cafeteria served 5,000 meals daily, suggesting round-the-clock operations. Most troubling, Harrison mentioned almost casually that Bethlehem was planning expansion. "We're adding 2 more construction bays next year," he said, gesturing toward empty ground. "The Navy Department wants us ready for increased demand. Not that we expect war, you understand, but readiness is prudence." Yamamoto understood perfectly. American industrial planning operated on assumptions Japan couldn't match. They built excess capacity as insurance. Japan strained to build necessary capacity. The Japanese naval delegation to the United States in the 1930s was not a casual diplomatic courtesy. It represented systematic intelligence gathering by officers who understood that future wars would be won in factories before battles were fought at sea. Admiral Yamamoto, who would later plan the Pearl Harbor attack, was among several senior officers who toured American industrial facilities during this period. Each returned with reports that should have changed Japanese strategic planning fundamentally. Instead, their warnings were largely ignored by a military leadership committed to expansion regardless of industrial reality. The visits began in earnest after the Washington Naval Treaty expired in 1936. Japan had withdrawn from naval limitation agreements, believing itself capable of challenging American and British naval supremacy in the Pacific. Japanese naval planners needed updated intelligence on on American shipbuilding capacity, steel production, and industrial organization. What they discovered exceeded their worst projections and contradicted every assumption underlying Japanese strategic planning. Captain Taman Yamaguchi, who would die commanding a carrier division at Midway, toured the Ford River Rouge complex in Dearborn, Michigan, in January 1937. His report to the Navy Ministry documented industrial capacity that seemed fictional to Tokyo planners. The River Rouge complex covered 0.5 square miles. It employed 100,000 workers across 100 buildings. Raw materials entered one end, iron ore, coal, limestone, and finished automobiles emerged from the other end at the rate of one complete vehicle every 49 seconds. The complex generated its own electricity, produced its own steel, manufactured its own glass, and even grew its own soybeans for paint production. Yamaguchi's report contained a crucial observation. This single facility produces more tonnage of finished goods annually than the entire Japanese manufacturing sector. The Americans have industrialized at a scale we cannot comprehend from Tokyo. Our strategic planning assumes American industrial capacity comparable to our own, multiplied by 3 or 4. The actual multiplier is closer to 20. The report was filed and largely forgotten. Japanese military planners were committed to the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, an imperial expansion that would bring resources and industrial capacity under Japanese control. They calculated that capturing Dutch oil fields, British rubber plantations, and Chinese manufacturing would close the industrial gap with America. What they failed to understand was that American industrial supremacy wasn't based on resources, but on organizational efficiency, mass production techniques, and a cultural approach to manufacturing that Japan couldn't replicate even with conquered territories. Rear Admiral Shigeyoshi Miwa toured Boeing's Seattle facility in March 1937, ostensibly as part of a delegation studying civilian aviation. What he observed was military aviation potential that staggered his calculations. Boeing was producing commercial aircraft at rates suggesting military conversion capacity far beyond Japanese projections. The assembly lines, the worker training programs, the engineering offices all indicated an industry that could shift to military production almost overnight. Miwa's report noted, Boeing alone could outproduce our entire aircraft industry within 6 months of war declaration. Their workers are trained in mass production techniques we have not yet implemented. Their engineers use standardization that allows parts interchangeability we still struggle to achieve. If war comes, American skies will darken with aircraft before we complete our first production expansion. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who would lead the first wave of Pearl Harbor attack aircraft, visited Pittsburgh steel mills in June 1937. His official role was studying metallurgy for improved armor plating. What he actually documented was industrial capacity that revealed Japanese vulnerability. The Pittsburgh mills produced more steel tonnage in 1 month than Japan's entire annual steel production. The mills operated continuously, 3 shifts daily, with worker productivity that exceeded Japanese rates by factors of 5 or 6. Most alarming to Fuchida was the casualness of the operation. The mills were producing at perhaps 70% of capacity with unused furnaces held in reserve. Mill supervisors spoke of expansion plans, additional capacity coming online, new techniques that would increase efficiency further. They weren't straining to meet demand. They were preparing for demand that didn't yet exist. Fuchida's report concluded bleakly, we are planning war against a nation that treats warship-grade steel production as peacetime industrial slack. Their reserve capacity exceeds our maximum capacity. This is not a military disadvantage. It is economic suicide. These reports accumulated in Tokyo throughout 1937 and 1938, creating a body of intelligence that should have fundamentally altered Japanese strategic thinking. Some senior officers understood the implications immediately. Admiral Yamamoto, promoted to Vice Minister of the Navy in 1936, used the intelligence to argue against war with America. In multiple meetings with government officials and military leadership, he presented the industrial mathematics that made prolonged war with America unwinnable. His warnings became increasingly specific and increasingly ignored. In a meeting with Prime Minister Prince Fumimaro Konoe in 1937, Yamamoto stated bluntly, "If ordered to fight America, I can guarantee wild success for 6 months, perhaps a year. After that, I have no expectation of success." The Prime Minister asked what Yamamoto recommended. "Avoid war with America at all costs. If we fight America, we will lose. Not because their navy is superior today, it isn't, but because their shipyards will build a superior navy while we fight. We cannot win a production war against American industry. It's mathematical certainty, not military opinion." The warnings were dismissed by the army faction that dominated Japanese military planning. General Hideki Tojo, who would become Prime Minister in October 1941 and lead Japan into war, represented a military philosophy that valued warrior spirit over industrial calculation. Tojo and his supporters believed that Japanese fighting spirit, tactical excellence, and willingness to sacrifice would overcome American material advantages. They assumed Americans were soft, unwilling to endure hardship, likely to sue for peace after early defeats. This fundamental misunderstanding of American character, combined with deliberate ignorance of American industrial capacity, drove Japan toward a war its own naval experts knew was unwinnable. The disconnect between naval intelligence and army planning created a surreal situation where Japan's most informed naval officers privately predicted defeat while publicly supporting military operations they knew would fail. Admiral Yamamoto's prediction of 6 to 12 months of success before American industrial superiority became overwhelming proved remarkably accurate. Pearl Harbor was attacked on December 7th, 1941. The Battle of Midway, where American industrial capacity began translating into battlefield superiority, occurred June 4th through 7th, 1942, exactly 6 months later. The Japanese naval attachés who toured American facilities in the 1930s documented specific industrial advantages that explained why prolonged war was impossible to win. Their reports covered critical areas where American industrial organization exceeded Japanese capacity by orders of magnitude. First, standardization and interchangeable parts. American manufacturers had implemented complete parts standardization across product lines. A bolt from a Ford factory fit precisely into a General Motors engine. Aircraft components from different manufacturers were interchangeable. This allowed rapid production scaling and field repairs that Japanese forces couldn't match. Japanese manufacturing still relied heavily on hand-fitting and individual craftsmanship, beautiful but slow. Second, labor productivity through mechanization. American workers operated machinery that multiplied their output exponentially. One American machinist with proper equipment produced more in a day than 10 Japanese craftsmen using traditional methods. This wasn't about worker quality, but about industrial investment in productivity multiplying technology that Japan lacked capital to implement broadly. Third, electrical power infrastructure. American industrial facilities had virtually unlimited electrical power from massive grid systems. Japanese factories often operated on limited power schedules, restricting production hours. The electrical infrastructure alone gave American industry a productivity advantage of approximately 3 to 1 before considering other factors. Fourth, integrated supply chains. American manufacturers operated with raw material supply chains that delivered resources with extraordinary reliability. Steel mills received iron ore via Great Lakes shipping with precision that allowed continuous operations. Japanese supply chains, even before war disrupted them, operated with uncertainty that forced manufacturers to maintain expensive inventory buffers. Fifth, education and engineering culture. American engineers numbered in the tens of thousands, graduates of extensive university programs emphasizing practical problem-solving. Japan produced excellent engineers, but in far smaller numbers, and their training emphasized theoretical perfection over practical improvisation. This difference became critical when war demanded rapid innovation and field modifications. Captain Sadatoshi Tomioka, a staff officer in the Navy Ministry, synthesized the various intelligence reports into a comprehensive assessment in 1938. His document, which was classified and shown only to senior naval officers, painted a picture of industrial mismatch so severe that war with America resembled economic suicide more than military strategy. Tomioka calculated specific production ratios that revealed the impossibility of sustained warfare. American steel production exceeded Japanese production by 12-1. American aluminum production, critical for aircraft, exceeded Japanese capacity by 15-1. American petroleum production, essential for naval operations, exceeded Japanese production by 100-1, with Japan importing 90% of oil needs from sources America could easily interdict. American electrical generating capacity exceeded Japanese capacity by 10-1. American machine tool production, the foundation of all manufacturing, exceeded Japanese production by 20-1. Tomioka's conclusion was mathematically irrefutable. We cannot win a prolonged war against America. The industrial differential is too great. If war comes, it must be short, victorious, and end with negotiated peace that preserves our gains. If America chooses to fight a production war, we will lose. The only question is how long we can delay inevitable defeat. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The tragedy of Japanese strategic planning was that these assessments were accurate, detailed, and completely ignored by the military faction committed to war. The Army leadership, which dominated strategic planning by 1940, dismissed naval concerns about industrial capacity as defeatism. They pointed to Japanese tactical victories in China as evidence that fighting spirit overcame material disadvantages. They argued that capturing resource territories in Southeast Asia would solve supply problems. They convinced themselves that one decisive naval battle would force American peace negotiations. Every assumption was wrong. The decisive battle at Midway did occur, but it destroyed Japanese naval aviation rather than American will to fight. Captured territories provided resources, but no industrial capacity to convert resources into weapons. Most fundamentally, American fighting spirit, once engaged, proved equal to Japanese determination, while backed by overwhelming material superiority. The Japanese naval officers, who had warned against war, watched their predictions come true with mounting horror. They had done the mathematics, toured the factories, and reported honestly. Their warnings were ignored by political and military leadership, committed to expansion regardless of industrial reality. Admiral Yamamoto, who planned Pearl Harbor despite believing war was unwinnable, operated under orders from a government that dismissed his warnings about American industrial capacity. His 6-month prediction of success was based on the intelligence reports from his own and other officers' tours of American facilities in the 1930s. He knew exactly how long Japanese tactical excellence could prevail before American factories buried Japanese forces under mountains of ships, aircraft, and ammunition. The attack on Pearl Harbor commenced at 7:58 a.m. Hawaiian time on December the 7th, 1941. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had toured Pittsburgh steel mills 4 years earlier and written reports about unbeatable American industrial capacity, led the first wave of 183 aircraft toward the American Pacific Fleet. As his aircraft descended toward Battleship Row, Fuchida transmitted the code phrase, "Tora Tora, signaling complete surprise, had been achieved. What he couldn't signal was the certainty, formed during his American tour, that this tactical victory was beginning a strategic catastrophe. The attack sank 4 battleships, damaged 4 more, destroyed 188 aircraft, and killed 2,403 Americans. In Tokyo, the news was received with jubilation. In Washington, it unified a previously divided nation. And in American shipyards from California to Massachusetts, the facilities Japanese officers had toured 5 years earlier began mobilizing for production warfare on a scale that would validate every warning their reports had contained. 48 hours after Pearl Harbor, President Franklin Roosevelt met with industrial leaders to discuss war production targets. The numbers proposed seemed fantastical, even to American planners. 60,000 aircraft in 1942, 125,000 in 1943, 45,000 tanks in 1942, 75,000 in 1943, 8 million tons of shipping in 1942, 10 million in 1943. William Knudsen, director of the Office of Production Management and former president of General Motors, reviewed the targets and told Roosevelt, "Mr. President, these numbers are impossible by any historical standard. We'll exceed them." He was right. By 1943, American industry was producing aircraft at rates that exceeded Roosevelt's ambitious targets. The factories Japanese officers had toured were now running at capacity they hadn't shown to foreign visitors. Bethlehem Steel, where Admiral Yamamoto had watched casual efficiency in 1936, was now launching a new destroyer every 72 days. The Ford River Rouge complex, which Captain Yamaguchi had documented producing 1 automobile every 49 seconds, had converted to aircraft production and was completing 1 B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. Japanese naval planners watched American production reports with growing despair. Every intelligence estimate of American capacity had underestimated actual performance. The Americans weren't just producing more than predicted, they were accelerating production beyond what Japanese analysts thought physically possible. Admiral Osamu Nagano, chief of the Naval General Staff, received monthly intelligence updates that read like industrial horror stories. In January 1942, American shipyards launched 300,000 tons of new shipping. By June, monthly production had reached 600,000 tons. By December, it exceeded 1 million tons monthly. Japan's entire shipbuilding industry, operating at maximum capacity, produced approximately 200,000 tons monthly. The Americans were building ships 5 times faster than Japan could, and the gap was widening. The Bethlehem Shipyard that Yamamoto had toured was now one of 17 major yards running at capacity, with dozens of smaller yards contributing additional production. Most crushing for Japanese planners was aircraft production data. In 1942, Japan produced 8,861 military aircraft, straining every factory to maximum output. The United States produced 47,836 aircraft that same year, more than 5 times Japanese production, while simultaneously supplying aircraft to Britain, the Soviet Union, and other allies. By 1943, American aircraft production reached 85,998 units, while Japanese production peaked at 16,693 aircraft. The Boeing facility that Rear Admiral Miwa had toured in 1937 was producing B-17 Flying Fortresses at rates that seemed impossible. The Seattle plant alone was completing 16 aircraft daily. Other manufacturers, Douglas, Consolidated, Lockheed, were matching or exceeding Boeing's output. Japanese factories that produced 2 or 3 aircraft daily per facility were being overwhelmed by an industrial system producing hundreds of aircraft daily across dozens of plants. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 became the moment when American industrial capacity began translating into battlefield superiority. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, representing the core of Japanese naval aviation. These vessels couldn't be replaced. Japanese shipyards required 3 to 4 years to build a fleet carrier, and even that timeline assumed unlimited resources and no enemy interference. The Americans lost one carrier, the Yorktown, which had been damaged at the Coral Sea, partially repaired in 72 hours, and sent back into action. American shipyards were already constructing Essex-class carriers that would replace losses with vessels superior to anything Japan could build. Between 1943 and 1945, American shipyards would launch 17 Essex-class fleet carriers, more than Japan would build in its entire history. Admiral Yamamoto, commanding the combined fleet from his flagship Yamato, understood the implications immediately. His chief of staff found him studying production reports on June 7, 1942, the day after Midway ended. "We have lost this war," Yamamoto said quietly. "Not at Midway, though that accelerates our defeat. We lost this war the moment it began. The Americans are building ships faster than we can sink them, training pilots faster than we can kill them, producing aircraft faster than we can destroy them. I warned them in Tokyo. They didn't listen." Yamamoto's prediction of 6 months of success had been precisely accurate. From December 7, 1941 to June 7, 1942 was exactly 6 months. Japanese forces had conquered territory, sunk ships, and won tactical victories. But in those same 6 months, American shipyards had launched dozens of warships. Aircraft factories had produced thousands of planes, and training facilities had graduated tens of thousands of replacement pilots. The industrial war that Yamamoto had warned about was now beginning, and Japan had no response. The Americans implemented mass production techniques to shipbuilding that Japanese observers would have considered impossible had they witnessed them. Henry Kaiser, an industrialist with no shipbuilding experience, revolutionized the industry by applying assembly line principles to ship construction. His Liberty ship program built cargo vessels in an average of 42 days, with the record being 4 days and 15 hours for the SS Robert E. Peary. Kaiser's yards would build 1,490 ships during the war. Japan's entire merchant marine at war's start numbered approximately 6 million tons. American shipyards would replace that entire tonnage every 6 months. By war's end, the United States launched 60 million tons of new shipping, enough to replace Japanese merchant losses 10 times over. The submarine campaign against Japanese shipping, which would eventually strangle Japan's economy, was only possible because American shipyards could build submarines faster than Japan could sink them. Electric Boat Company and other yards produced 203 submarines during the war. Each submarine sank on average 5 to 10 Japanese vessels before being lost. The mathematics was devastating. Japan couldn't sink submarines fast enough to prevent them from destroying the merchant fleet that carried resources from conquered territories to Japanese factories. Aircraft production disparities created aerial dominance that Japanese pilots couldn't overcome through skill or courage. By 1943, American factories were producing trained pilots faster than Japan could shoot them down. The Japanese training pipeline, which emphasized quality over quantity, produced perhaps 1,500 to 2,000 combat-ready pilots annually. American training facilities graduated 50,000 pilots in 1943 alone. When Japanese aces shot down American aircraft, replacement pilots arrived within weeks. When American pilots shot down Japanese aces, those irreplaceable veterans carrying years of experience, Japan couldn't replicate. Lieutenant Commander Takeo Shibata, a staff officer who had toured American facilities in the 1930s, wrote in his personal diary in November 1943, "We are watching the warnings come true exactly as predicted. Every month, American strength increases while ours decreases. The officers who toured American factories knew this would happen. We reported it. We were ignored. Now we fight a war we cannot win, watching our predictions unfold with terrible precision." Admiral Yamamoto never saw the full fruition of American industrial superiority. On April 18th, 1943, his aircraft was intercepted and shot down by American P-38 fighters over Bougainville. The Americans had decoded Japanese communications and knew his exact flight path. The admiral who had warned Japan against fighting America died in the jungle, killed by the industrial system he had tried to make his superiors understand. His death marked symbolic defeat. The officer who knew America best, who had studied at Harvard, served as naval attaché in Washington, and toured American industrial facilities, was gone. The Japanese military leadership was left with officers who hadn't seen American factories, hadn't calculated the mathematics, didn't understand what they were fighting. By 1944, American industrial dominance had become so overwhelming that Japanese forces fought not to win, but to delay inevitable defeat. The Marianas Campaign in June and July 1944 demonstrated the complete disparity. Japan lost 3 fleet carriers and approximately 600 aircraft in the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Americans lost 123 aircraft, mostly to operational accidents, and 0 capital ships. The replacement rates told the story. Japan couldn't replace the 3 carriers for years. American shipyards had 8 Essex-class carriers under construction that would commission within 6 months. Japan couldn't replace the 600 lost aircraft for months. American factories would replace them in 6 days. The human cost of ignored warnings became visible in every battle. Japanese pilots flew obsolete aircraft because factories couldn't produce advanced models fast enough. Japanese ships lacked radar because electronics production was insufficient. Japanese soldiers fought with inadequate supplies because merchant shipping couldn't sustain supply lines that American submarines cut mercilessly. Captain Yamaguchi, who had toured the Ford River Rouge complex and warned about American production capacity, died at Midway, commanding the carrier Hiryu. His last message, before ordering abandoned ship, reportedly included the phrase, I told them what we would face. Captain Tomioka, who had synthesized intelligence reports into a comprehensive assessment that war was unwinnable, survived to serve on the Naval General Staff, watching his predictions come true month by month. His diary entries from 1944 reveal an officer living through a preventable catastrophe, bound by duty to serve a strategy he knew was hopeless. The Philippines campaign in 1944 showcased American material superiority, so complete that Japanese tactics became suicide operations because conventional warfare was impossible. The kamikaze attacks, which began in October 1944, represented strategic desperation more than tactical innovation. Japan couldn't produce enough aircraft or train enough pilots to fight conventionally, so they turned pilots and planes into guided missiles, trading guaranteed losses for potential damage. American industrial capacity even absorbed kamikaze attacks through sheer production volume. A kamikaze strike that sank or damaged a destroyer was tragic for the crew, but strategically meaningless when American shipyards were producing destroyers faster than kamikazes could sink them. Between October 1944 and August 1945, approximately 3,800 kamikaze aircraft attacked American vessels. They sank 47 ships and damaged 300. American shipyards launched 437 destroyers during the war. The production rate exceeded the destruction rate by factors of 10. By early 1945, Japan's industrial capacity had collapsed under blockade, bombing, and resource starvation. The factories that had struggled to match American production in 1942 were producing almost nothing by 1945. Aircraft production fell from 16,000 annually to barely 3,000. Steel production dropped by 80%. Oil supplies, already critically short, vanished almost completely as American submarines sank every tanker that ventured from ports. The Strategic Bombing Survey, conducted after the war, documented Japanese industrial collapse with stark statistics. By August 1945, Japanese factories operated at 12% of 1941 capacity. Transportation systems had been destroyed by bombing. Raw materials couldn't reach factories. Power generation was intermittent. Labor forces were starving. The industrial system that had struggled to compete with America in 1941 had effectively ceased to exist by war's end. The officers who had warned against war watched this collapse with bitter awareness that everything they had predicted had occurred. Admiral Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack and toured American steel mills in the 1930s, survived the war. In post-war interviews, he stated bluntly, "We knew we couldn't win a production war. Every officer who toured American facilities knew this. We reported it. The Army leadership dismissed our warnings as defeatism. So we fought a war we knew was impossible to win and lost exactly as we predicted." The final irony was that American industrial supremacy in 1945 exceeded even the optimistic projections Japanese officers had made during their 1930s tours. The shipyards they had seen producing one destroyer every 6 months in peacetime were now launching one destroyer every 14 days in wartime. The aircraft factories producing civilian planes at measured rates were producing military aircraft at rates that would have seemed impossible to pre-war observers. By war's end, the United States had produced 300,000 aircraft, 87,000 tanks, 341 billion rounds of ammunition, and 41 billion tons of shipping. Japan had produced 70,000 aircraft, 10,000 tanks, 8 billion rounds of ammunition, and 4 million tons of shipping. Every category showed American production advantages of 5 to 1, 10 to 1, or greater. The industrial differential that Japanese naval officers had documented in the 1930s had widened rather than narrowed during the war. American industry hadn't just outproduced Japan, it had accelerated while Japanese industry collapsed. The human tragedy was that thousands of young Japanese pilots, sailors, and soldiers died fighting a war that their own senior officers knew was unwinnable before it started. Every kamikaze pilot who dove his aircraft into an American ship, every soldier who fought to the death on Pacific Islands, every sailor who went down with his ship, they all died in service to a strategy that ignored expert warnings and mathematical certainty. The officers who had toured American factories and written honest reports carried this knowledge as a terrible burden. They had done their duty, provided accurate intelligence, calculated the mathematics. Their warnings were dismissed by a military leadership that valued fighting spirit over industrial reality. Then, those same officers were ordered to fight the unwinnable war they had warned against. Some, like Yamamoto, died in combat. Others survived to see total defeat and to carry for the rest of their lives the knowledge that they had been right, and being right had made no difference. In 1950, 5 years after Japan's surrender, several surviving officers who had toured American facilities in the 1930s gathered in Tokyo for a private meeting. They discussed their pre-war reports and how precisely their warnings had proven accurate. Admiral Tomioka, who had synthesized the intelligence assessments, spoke for many when he said, "We did our duty. We reported honestly. We calculated correctly. We were ignored. The tragedy is not that we lost the war. The tragedy is that the war happened at all. Every death, every destroyed city, every burnt ship, all of it was preventable. We told them." They wouldn't listen. The lesson extends beyond Japanese military history to every situation where expert warnings are dismissed because they conflict with desired policy. The Japanese officers who toured American factories provided their government with accurate intelligence that should have prevented war. Instead, political leadership and army planners, committed to expansion and convinced of their own martial superiority, ignored mathematics that didn't support their preferences. The result was a war that killed millions, destroyed Japanese cities, and ended exactly as the ignored experts predicted it would. The admirals who warned that Japan would last only 6 to 12 months against American industrial capacity were proven correct with terrible precision. Their story stands as testament to the cost of ignoring expertise the danger of confusing desired outcomes with realistic possibilities, and the tragedy that unfolds when warnings are dismissed because they're inconvenient to policy preferences. Admiral Yamamoto's pre-war statement to Prime Minister Konoe captured the essential truth the Japanese military leadership refused to accept. If we fight America, we will lose. Not because their navy is superior today, it isn't, but because their shipyards will build a superior navy while we fight. Every word proved accurate. The shipyard's Japanese officers had toured in the 1930s, built the navy that destroyed Japan's fleet, exactly as those officers warned they would. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.